And behold, one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then should the scriptures be fulfilled that it must be so?" That hour Jesus said to the crowds, "Have you come out against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But all this has taken place that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled." Then all the disciples left him and fled. I'll address the whole "all who takes the sword will perish by the sword" thing a little more when we cover Peter next lesson, but I want to address it here as well because it fits the context of Jesus' trial more than it does Peter's. Can we extrapolate from this a general principle that men who live violent lives often end with violent deaths? Yes. But we cannot make the leap that physical force is never appropriate. David was a great warrior and yet is described as a man after God's own heart. God himself is described as a mighty warrior in the song sung by the Hebrews during their exodus from Egypt. Most of the heroes of the Bible were mighty men of valor. But that's the Old Testament. Jesus is the Prince of Peace, some of you will say. If that's your position, don't read Revelation, because you are in for quite a shock how Jesus is described on Judgment Day. Like I said, we need to put this directly in the context of the moment. Jesus had just spent hours struggling with this final phase of his mission. He was resisting the cross, but had resolved that not his will, but God the Father's will be done. From here on out, there was no turning back. Had Peter been awake with Jesus when he prayed like Jesus had asked, perhaps he'd be up to speed with the plan. But he wasn't. As is his way, he lashed out impulsively. But let's look at this total scene again. 11 disciples are surrounded by a great crowd with swords and clubs. John 18:3 tells us that it wasn't just temple guards, but a detachment of Roman soldiers as well. The Roman legion was the Marine Corps of its day. It had basically conquered the entire known world and brought about 200 years of global peace. Luke 22 tells us that at the Last Supper, a few hours earlier, Jesus had just told his disciples that for their protection, if they don't possess a sword, they better sell their cloak and go buy one. And we all know from John that it's Peter who actually cuts Malchus' ear off. What most people don't realize is that though Peter is the first to act, he is on the same page as the rest of the disciples. Per Luke 22:49, when those who were around him saw what would follow, they said, "Lord, shall we strike with the sword?" The problem was that they heard half of what Jesus told them at the Last Supper, but failed to comprehend the other half. They got his message that for their own protection, they would soon need a sword, but they missed his far more important message that what was written about Christ was about to be fulfilled. Christ's command to put away their swords had two important aspects. The first is what this lesson has been all about. Christ immediately rebukes Peter, asking, "Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me?" This is about trusting God's prophesied plan and not our own. It is about trusting the cross for our salvation, not our own futile efforts. The second part is the fact that Jesus was saving his disciples. As I mentioned earlier, we are talking about 11 disciples from various trades, none of whom were trained as soldiers. Peter's not John Wick. In fact, we can likely assume that Peter wasn't aiming for Malchus' ear, but his head. He intended his blow to be a fatal one and missed. How in the world would he be able to take on a large crowd, including trained temple guards and a Roman detachment, when he couldn't even kill a servant? We don't need to spiritualize Jesus' meaning when he says, "Put your swords back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword," when it's quite literally true that if his disciples didn't sheathe their swords immediately, they would most certainly be slaughtered where they stood, or arrested and crucified alongside of him. The same as telling them to buy a sword was meant for their own protection in the missionary work they were about to embark upon. It was also for their immediate protection that he told them at this moment to put their swords away, lest they be killed. Jesus had a mission to fulfill, but so did they. And while they would face similar deaths as their master one day, this was not meant to be that day. Jesus is intervening to de-escalate the situation and save the disciples' hides. It was clear what was about to happen because it is at this point that all the disciples fled into the darkness of night.